Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
The honeybee has been called the most beneficial insect known to man. There are over 7,000 hives in commercial honey production in Kansas, producing over 525,000 pounds of honey. But yet these numbers are well down from the past. Successful beekeeping takes time, education, and money, in addition to a love for the business. We'll learn more about honey production on this episode of Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Are there different types of honey?
There are so many different types of honey. It depends on what the bee, actually the flower that the bee works on. And so we like to say there's about 300 different varietals of honey, just like wines. There's different kind of wines. There's so many different flowers in the springtime. We may have dandelions, and the bees will, you guys that hate dandelions in your yard, beekeepers like them. And we don't harvest any dandelion honey because the bees will work it in the springtime, but they consume it so fast that they consume it from themselves. But you could get dandelion honey. In the central part of the U.S., we have a lot of alfalfa and clover. We can have soybeans, is what our main crops are off. But then we also have a lot of the fall flowers. Even the pink flower you may see growing in the ditches, smartweed or heartsease, that produces a real strong flavored honey compared to the clover or the soybean or alfalfa.
At any one time we have in our house probably 12 to 15 and just keep rotating. Go to different stores, find different varietals. Not so much imported honey. You can buy honey in the big box stores that's imported from Argentina and Brazil. I don't really recommend that because all of those honeys have been blended. You don't know what the source is. So buy honey that you can identify the source from a local beekeeper or from a local grocery store, that the source is clearly indicated on the jar.
Typically, we're going to have what we call, in our hobby business, we call it wildflower honey. We could say that this honey we're selling today at the farmer's market is clover honey, and it probably has a lot of clover in it. It probably has some alfalfa in it, probably has some dandelion in it. So we just typically call it wildflower and call it good, and that encompasses everything.
How much honey does a honeybee make?
The average bee itself only makes about 1/10 of a tablespoon of honey in its lifetime. So that's not very much, 1/10 of a tablespoon. Now, a beehive in Kansas, the whole hive, which will have 75,000 bees in the summertime, averages, in our outfit, we used to say an average between 60 and 70 pounds is about what we had averaged. So that's a lot of bees doing a lot of work. And doing a lot of flying to be able to make 60 or 70 pounds that we would harvest from the hives. We still have to leave about 40 or 50 pounds of honey in the hives for the hives to be able to winter on.
During the spring and summer, the honeybees are collecting nectar, turning it into honey to feed their young and feed themselves, because that's their food source. And so throughout the whole course of the year, a good healthy hive might make 200 to 300 pounds of honey. Some they're going to consume, some we're going to leave them in the fall when we remove our share, or what we hope is our share, and then there's our share in there. So we have those three portions of honey that they produce throughout the entire season. Could be a couple of 100 pounds or more per hive.
Tell us how long honey has been around.
Now, mankind has had a relationship with bees for at least 7,000 years. There are some caves in Bicorp, Spain, that have drawings of cavemen hanging from ropes, smoking bees living in trees or holes in the walls or what have you, the caves, I should say. And those have been dated for about 7,000 years. So we've at least been collecting honey for that length of time anyway.
Can you explain why bees are an important pollinator in agriculture?
honeybees produce $15 billion worth of pollination in the U.S. for agriculture. 1 out of 3 bites that you eat has to do with the honey, the pollination that the bees do. And so bees are real important. And again, honeybees, there's other species of insects that do pollination, but none of them do in depth what honeybees do. Honeybees are one of the few controlled insects that you actually can control. It's hard to control like a monarch butterfly or a lot of other insects. And so there are other leafcutter bees and stuff like that that can be controlled. But there's a second reason why honeybees are so important. All the other insects have no secondary crop. Honeybees produce honey, and so there's value in the honeybees. And so a lot of times our pollination that beekeepers do, they charge zero for that because they get a crop of honey off of it. If you have some other kind of pollinator, which again, they're very small in numbers, but there's no secondary crop, and so your pollination is very expensive off of it.
The thing about honeybees is they live in a mobile hive. We put them in managed boxes, so we call them managed pollinators. Unlike, say, the bumblebees or hummingbirds that just come through by happenstance, if you have a crop that you need to have pollinated, like pumpkins or what have you, you contact a beekeeper and he or she can locate several hives on your property to take care of the job for you.
How can we help bees continue to thrive?
There's a lot of controversies out there about pesticides, for example. There's a fairly new family of pesticides that are very effective in the agriculture industry, but there's always collateral damage, and unfortunately the honeybees may be part of a victim of that collateral damage. I would say if we don't need to use chemicals, let's not. Let's try some kind of integrated pest control, some other natural methods whenever possible. And when you go down to the plant center to buy your shrubs and flowers for the year, sometimes on the label they will say if they are or are not treated with a systemic insecticide. And those are the ones that may cause the problems with the bees. And I say systemic because the seeds may be coated or the plant itself may be coated with a chemical, but the pesticide will travel throughout the plant. So as a critter feeds on the leaves, it's going to perish from the poison because it's in the leaves. And as a honeybee flies along, lands on the flower, and takes up nectar, some of that chemical will also be within the nectar. It may not kill the bee, but it may not do the young who are developing back in the hive much good either.
We've had a struggle, obviously, in the last 8-10 years with a disease called colony collapse disorder. And I call it the perfect storm. And I'm going to get to the answer to your question in a little bit. But the problem with, I believe it's some of the chemicals that we have, some of the climate change that's gone on. It's also beekeepers like myself move bees all over the United States for pollination purposes, and so that puts another stress on bees. We imported some bees from Australia in the mid-2000s that had a virus that we didn't know about it, and the Australian bees were immune to it, but our bees weren't. And then we have a couple mites that are on the honeybees. So you put the 5 things together, or 5 or 6 things together, and we have what I call a perfect storm. So how can we, if it's like an elderly person getting the flu, somebody in the nursing home getting the flu, it could kill them. Where you and I get the flu, we'll be just fine. If we could eliminate or reduce some of the things in that perfect storm, we could be better. We've had a lot of, over the years, monoculture farming. If we can actually plant pollinating plants, there's more and more plants out there that are being available. Even the big chemical companies, Bayer, Monsanto, and so forth, are actually promoting buying pollinator plants and plant those in your waterways or roadsides or stuff like that. So that can help bees a lot. So, and use your chemicals responsibly. As we're talking to farmers, tank mixes can be, you think, oh, I can do this or that. We've had some aerial applicators that have sprayed sunflowers in 10% bloom at the right time of the day, real early in the morning, and my bees have not been hurt at all by it. So again, if you do things by label, according to directions, and be responsible about it, we can coexist. Beekeepers and agriculturists can coexist very well together. But if we get real sloppy about it, we can be really hard on it. So it's using chemicals responsibly, and it's also, if you can plant some other pollinating flowers, and there's if you just Google, and that's the easiest way to do things, Google pollinating plants, and they have Mississippi East and Mississippi West plants and this has just been developing within the last couple of years. My family is the largest honey producing family in the world, and they produce in the 15 million pounds of honey a year. And so, in fact, they produce about 10 to 15% of the honey produced in the U.S. My family, aunts and uncles and cousins and so forth. In fact, our family reunions are like many bee conventions anymore. So,
When it comes to a hive, can you tell us what the upkeep process is?
We just harvested, for example, here in western Kansas just a few weeks ago at our operation. So this time of year now we're reflecting on what went wrong, what did well. Of course, we can't do anything about nature and rain, but that's the thing that went very well this year. So now we're thinking, okay, what equipment do I need to replace? What do I need to repair? Where am I going to move my bees next year? What fields looked better this summer than they did the year before, and what landowners will I be maybe contacting to move bees onto. And unfortunately right now I have more potential properties to place bees than I have bees to place them. So when I started off in this hobby years ago, I was looking for places to put bees, and as word gets out, that problem went away. Now I need more bees.
Beekeeping is interesting. It's not like having a garden or well, maybe it could be closer to having a garden, but it's not like having a cow. You can have one beehive, or you can have 80,000 beehives like my uncle. And in that one beehive, you can, in nature, a beehive can live in a tree, basically unmolested, if you'd want to say, but you can also take beehive and work with it to get the most out of it. You've seen a farmer who, or somebody who has a garden, and they may plant a couple kernels of corn, leave it and do nothing with it the rest of the year, and they may get a crop off of it. As compared to these top-notch best farmers who does every little thing to make it the best in the world. Beekeeping's a lot like that. You can just nonchalant, not be able to do very much with it, or you can to work with it to be able to make it the very best. And of course, the American Honey Producers Association, which I was the executive director for 8 years, our issue was to try to get the most out of beekeeping in your beehives and to do the best, because and some people think, oh, well, you're hard on the bees. No, those are our livelihoods, just like a cattle farmer. There's people think that, oh, well, you guys feed lots and everything, that's bad. Well, we weren't bad on our bees. We want to try to make them live and do the best with them. So typically we visited beehive about 8 times a year. So it's not a daily thing. Like if I had a cow, I'd have to feed it every day probably, unless it just turned out to pasture. But there'd be about 8 different processes through the year, and checking it in the springtime to make sure it has enough feed, putting more boxes on top of them, make sure it's queen, put a new queen in it in the springtime, putting more of the bee boxes on top or the honey supers on it, and then usually that takes maybe 2 different rounds of doing that, coming down again in August and harvesting, maybe 2 different harvest times, and then getting them ready for the winter time to make sure they have enough feed in the winter.
It seems like getting the bees to survive winter is our biggest challenges, quite frankly. We may get them to March, and that's where things can go wrong. So we need to monitor our bees in the late winter, early spring. And then if you're a migratory beekeeper, meaning you work for pollination, this is the time of year you're going to be moving your bees, is in the early spring. And we can back the calendar up to, say, February now. The biggest pollination project in the world happens in Northern California. The almonds that are grown there. If I'm an almond farmer, I have to have at least 2 beehives per acre of trees so I can insure my crop. And I have to document that I have a contract with a beekeeper or my own bees that are on premise. So about a couple of million beehives are moved into California or around California just for the almond production, and some of those will be overwintered in Texas or other warmer southern states, so they're booming in February, because in February our bees are still wishing spring was here, and they're not ready to do anything like that. So now we move up to April. Again, we're getting into spring. Things are blooming. As I often joke, if you're a bee, there's no such thing as a weed. So we have the dandelions, the henbit, and all these, we'll call them weeds out there blooming away that my bees love, and I don't mind them either. They may be unattractive in the yard, but I'm glad when my neighbors don't mow and don't spray. So as spring moves along into summer, we're going to be adding more boxes called supers onto our hive as the bees start packing in more nectar, turning it into honey. And then now about this time of year, we're getting ready for winter, but as I had mentioned just a few weeks ago, we harvested honey. And that's a matter of removing those super boxes and running the frames inside those boxes through some processing equipment to extract the honey. And now in October, where our concern is we want to make sure mice don't get in our hive, so we're putting mouse guards, entrance reducers over the bottom of the hive. And a mouse may not kill a hive, but they're going to damage the frames inside by making a nest. And they could really tear up a beehive.
Where do you get the bees?
There's multiple ways to be able to get the bees. Occasionally you can, if you want to call it, harvest one out of a tree down in the woods or something like that. That's a little bit more difficult. Typically, you can go online anymore. Years ago, you used to be able to order a package of bees, a 2 or 3 pound package of bees out of the Sears and Roebuck catalog. Yeah, and for years and years and years, up until probably the 80s, maybe even after that. But my grandfather, who started in the 20s in beekeeping, you know, that's how you could do it. The other is knowing another beekeeper and having him sell you some bees. And there's beekeepers in the U.S. that's just their focus. Instead of raising honey, they'll take a beehive, split it in 2 or 3 or 4 ways, add queens to it, and make multiple hives. He doesn't get a honey crop out of it, but he gets a bee crop off of it. Then he can sell that. So in the U.S., there's only about 1,200 commercial beekeepers who are full-time. That's all they do. And then they'll employ, like my uncle has, 150 to 200 employees. But you can also, in the U.S., besides those 1,200 commercial beekeepers, there's about 300,000 hobbyist beekeepers who have 1, 2, 3, 5 hives. And then there's about I think it's 4,000 or 5,000 sideliner beekeepers who, it's a little bit more than a hobby. They may have some beehives, 25 to a couple, or maybe 100 beehives. They make a nice sideline income off of it.
So what I look for in a site to place my hives, I look for a nice windbreak, so the trees will block the winter winds and the snows won't overcome the hives. Ice is a bad thing because snow, the bees can work their way through the snow to get out to get fresh air on a warmish day in the winter, but ice will coat the hive and it doesn't ventilate, and I may have to chip the ice so that the hive can breathe, so we don't have moisture buildup in there. But yeah, I look for placing hives as a source of water, of course. Every living creature needs water, obviously flowers, so I'm looking for wild clovers and other things that I know are going to bloom in the area. Or maybe some crops like soybeans, alfalfa could be a good crop to make honey also, sunflowers. Again, we have to worry about the pesticide situation with those crops, so we're careful where we locate the hives and make sure that our farmers are as organic as possible and not just spray the daylights out of everything. And most of them are very conscious about that today.
There are beekeeping associations in the state of Kansas. There's a Kansas Honey Producers Association. There's another one that's real active called the Northeast Kansas Beekeepers Association. For instance, they had what they called a fun day or educational day last June. They had 300 in Olathe area, and they had 370 some people attend the event. And so that, and they're all people either learning to do a little bit about it. Getting a mentor is the best way, is find out somebody else, talk to them and learn. And we have actually a neighbor kid here now who started this last year with 4 beehives, and he got bit by it.
How do you store and ship honey?
Commercially, honey would be shipped typically in plastic-lined containers or epoxy-coated barrels, and that's about the largest size that most people ship honey. Maybe those big square plastic totes that you see with the metal cage around those, I think some producers are putting honey in those also, but honey is quite heavy. It weighs about 1.5 times as much as water, so it takes a substantial container to support honey and not be damaged by the weight.
And it's usually shipped on semi-loads when we ship it around commercially, so in 55-gallon barrels by the semi-load. Occasionally, some beekeepers are set up to have tankers, and there may be some of the tankers that go down the road. Very occasionally, there's a few large beekeepers that do that. Otherwise, in smaller quantities, 5-gallon buckets and so forth, but commercially, worldwide, it's usually 55-gallon barrels.
What are the benefits of honey in our diet?
Well, there are three primary ones that can be shared quickly. One is its effect on blood sugar. It's almost counterintuitive to say when you consume a sugar, which honey is, actually 2 sugars, it will lower your blood sugar. But that's the reality. When you consume natural raw honey, the 2 sugars in honey actually work in your body to reduce the level of blood sugar consistently across the board for anybody, whether or not they have insulin problems or diabetic problems or not. The second effect is its effect on sleep. Honey actually initiates and promotes sleep. It allows you to store fuel for the brain in the proper place, which is in the liver, so that the brain can be relaxed and sleep for 7 to 8 hours, which it was designed to do. The liver store only holds enough fuel for the brain for 7 to 8 hours. So most people eat at 6 o'clock at night or earlier. By 8 o'clock at night, the tank for the brain is full, but it burns 10 grams an hour. So in 7.5 hours from 8 o'clock, which is 3:30 in the morning, your brain is well supplied. But at 3:30 to 4 o'clock, it's out of fuel. And so it orchestrates a process in the body to create new sugar for itself, including the release of adrenaline from the adrenal glands, which wakes you right up. So people that have sleep problems typically are eating early and not eating before they go to bed. So my recommendation is the second benefit of honey is to use honey right before bed. The third thing that honey does is it has tremendous benefits for the immune system. Helps with allergies of all kinds. It actually has some anti-cancer benefits. It has benefits of reducing risks for heart disease. Those are the major effects of honey on human health. At no one time should you consume any more than 5 tablespoons of honey. And that's my recommendation throughout the day. A couple tablespoons at bedtime, 1 in the morning, and then if you exercise or work out or are particularly active, a tablespoon before and after. So 5 tablespoons a day maximum. Any more than that, you're running the risk of saturating the tank and overfilling the tank and spilling it out into the bloodstream and then having the same effect as consuming any other sugar. It will raise your blood sugar. The best recommendation is raw, natural, unprocessed honey. The reason I say unprocessed is you can buy honey in the little honey bears in the grocery store. It'll stay there uncrystallized for months on end. The reason it does is because the processing of honey that commercially involves for many packers heating the honey and then dumping into substance that is called diatomaceous earth and then having to microfilter to get all that stuff out. But what the diatomaceous earth does is removes all the pollen, all the particulate matter out of honey, so all you're left with is the sugars in honey. And it removes a lot of the pollen, which has about 60% of the benefits, the health benefits of honey come from the pollen. So the best honey is raw, unfiltered honey that's not been processed in a commercial production facility. The immune system benefits of consuming honey have a powerful benefit on allergies. So yes, honey, but it doesn't have to be local. Any honey will reduce allergic benefits or allergic symptoms and improve your allergy benefits.
We have diabetics who have really either been very close to being diabetic, who have 5 to 6 tablespoons of honey or drink 2 or 3 of our drinks a day, and they've actually turned around. Their doctor goes, "What are you doing? Your blood sugar level is so much different." And it's like, we're doing honey. Now, you got to be very careful when you start and when you're doing it. I'm not a doctor, but honey is that much more beneficial than any other sweeteners by far out there.
Is honey pasteurized?
Honey can be pasteurized. If the label on the honey jar in this grocery store at the farmer's market says raw honey, it has not been pasteurized. The whole typical meaning of the word raw means it came right out of the hive that way. Maybe some bits of wax and such were strained from it, but it was not superheated. You know, when it comes to milk, we want to pasteurize milk. It lasts longer on the shelves. But if we take honey and we superheat it to the point of pasteurization, now we're damaging some enzymes. We still have the sugars. They're still in there, the glucose and fructose that make up honey. And of course, the water is still within it. But we could now turn this liquid into a very fine liquid and run it through some extremely fine filters and remove the pollens. And now we have just sugars in our solution, which is still good and healthy for you, but the pollens and enzymes that we've damaged by pasteurizing are now probably gone by doing that process.
Most of the honey that's on the store, you see on the store shelf in the U.S., has been what I like to call the word processed instead of pasteurized, because it's a different process. Though people do call it pasteurized honey. But it's a misuse of the word pasteurized. But most commercially honey has been heated to 180 degrees, filtered or strained under pressure through diatomaceous earth filters down to 10 microns, 10 to 15 microns. That removes any particles out of the honey, including all the pollens. The smallest pollen micron is, pollen grain is 20 microns. They filter down to 10 to 15, so they remove all the pollens from the honey. The reason for doing it, for heating it to 180 degrees, it melts all the crystals. Crystallized honey, or hardened honey, is the solid form of honey, just like water, or ice is a solid form of water. And so it melts all of the crystals, but then crystals build on crystals, and so you need to remove any other particles out of the honey. So then it'll have what we call as a shelf life of 2 to 3 years sitting on a grocery store shelf. Again, that doesn't mean it's bad if it ever crystallizes. It just means it went to its solid state. So most processed honey, and I'll use the word processed instead of pasteurized, has been heated, most of the store shelf honey. Now there's a big kick now on raw honey, and that's one of the things that we're big on. The challenge with the raw honey is there's no standard of identity in the U.S. with USDA and FDA. What is raw honey? A few states say that's honey that hasn't been heated to 115, 118, or 120 degrees. We don't heat any of our honey over 115 or 118 degrees because that's not too much warmer than inside a beehive on a hot summer day. That's about what nature is. Our honey will granulate on you in time. And but there are people out there. I bought some store shelf honey that was called raw honey about 8 years ago, and it hasn't granulated. I think it was heated.
You can put honey in a jar and call it anything. You can put anything in a jar and call it honey. And in fact, that's what happens frequently, is that there are some products that are 49% honey. It's an industrial blend of honey that's contained less than 50% of honey, and the rest is some kind of syrup. So you really have to be careful. There's no standard of identity. You can call anything honey if you want to. The little packets of sweetener that you get that called honey from some of the fast food chains don't have much honey in it at all. And that's the unfortunate thing. So best to buy honey from a reputable producer, a beekeeper that you know, or from a store which sells honey that the country of origin is clearly labeled.
Pasteurization process came about in the 1920s, or really became popular, I should say. Sometime in the 20s, the consumer said, I don't want my honey to be solid anymore. Before that time, honey was always purchased already solidified, crystallized, and we sell that as a creamed honey product, we call it. It's not cream in it, but it's a creamed texture. And that's how honey was sold until the 20s, and then the consumers wanted liquid honey. Then they wanted to stay liquid a long time. So if we pasteurize that honey and super filter it, it may stay liquid on the shelf a lot longer than standard honey would right from my beehives. And as far as how long honey lasts, honey was found in King Tutankhamun's tomb back in 1922 when it was discovered, and it was in perfectly good shape. So I always say it has a shelf life of at least 3,400 years.
The number of hives and honey production is half of what it was 10 years ago. Raising honeybees has become more challenging in Kansas due to more efficient and sophisticated cropping systems. So next time you're shopping for honey, we hope you have a better understanding of honeybees and the production of honey. That's all for this episode of Real Ag. Remember, you can see every program of this series by going to smokyhillstv.org. On behalf of the Real Ag crew, I'm Kyle Bauer, and that's been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.